All right, guys. I have Dave Brown here with us from the YouTube channel Electric Universe Eyes, and he is making big waves in the Electric Universe community because he is making mountains and canyons from electricity because these things are scalable. Wouldn't you say, Dave?
From my observations, they absolutely look scalable. Yes, sir.
Now, if you don't mind, just briefly give me some background on what led you here.
Sure. I guess to start from the beginning is my upbringing, which I was raised in a very strict religion with some beliefs that if I would share what my beliefs were with others, I would be criticized for being a devil worshiper or of a cult, which was completely opposite. I was raised with a Christian view set and teachings. I went to church every Sunday. I went to the youth program on Wednesday. Even in my youth as a young man, went to seminary for an hour to study scripture before I went to school. So I got up at 5:30 every morning to go study seminary prior to going to school. And there was a conflict between what I would be studying in the scripture and how the world was created and what was experienced by people that was written in scripture versus what I was being taught at school. And, I always questioned what I was learning, both on the religious front as well as at school. And when I was a teenager, my parents split up and got a divorce, and that made me really consider everything for what it was. And I pretty much stopped going to church and experienced the world for what it was, because I wanted to know about other religions and other beliefs and what is life really all about. And fast forward, after working long hours and being part of the social system and being the everyday guy that fits in a box and has a family and has a hardworking job, and you do the same thing day in, day out. My wife and I, were spending our additional time being interested in conspiracy things to validate what is fact from fiction. And she came upon something she showed me, and we were looking at the Egyptian gods and the transgression of or the lineage of the gods and how they changed seats and how they transformed, and all of these unimaginable stories that are told not only in Egyptian culture but all of the other cultures followed through. But what that led me to was her showing me, I believe it was Symbols of an Alien Sky was the first video I watched, and that was by the Thunderbolts Project. So that was my first exposure to David Talbot and Wall Thornhill and Don Scott, and the way they painted the picture of the mythological stories and whatnot, it sounded exactly like what I grew up with. Hearing the archetype stories and the creation stories and the transgression of the gods, or the who the deity was and what that meant. And when I came across this series, they talked about how electricity works and showed experiments from guys in the lab like Billy Yelverton, and one of the other gentlemen that was involved was Michael Steinbacher, and he was a journalist that went out and took photographs of geological features and did a lot of comparisons and studies on geology to say, hey, was this formed by water or natural erosion or whatnot, or was the creation assisted by some sort of electrical discharge? And it was hearing the electric universe theory was the first time I really cared to go back and look at the scriptures that I grew up with. And I found myself engulfed with rereading the Genesis story and going through the Bible and rereading all the different scriptures, and then diving into other religious cultures and comparing all of those to what I had learned, or the idea that I got from the electric universe theory. And I got to the point to where I was trying to disprove the notion. My initial reaction was that of being cognitive dissonant, where my beliefs growing up, I couldn't correlate all of those things happening. However, I also couldn't deny all the fantastical stories that I've heard from American mythology or legends and folklore as well as the other cultural world mythological stories and things that I would attribute to being the same story told around the world, but based on what the localized cultural influence would be.
Right, and that's what we see in Velikovsky's book Worlds in Collision, where he compiles an amazing amount of this global mythology.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a book. My wife got me that book, and when I read Worlds in Collision, it changed how I perceived things. His viewpoint and his studies and his comparisons gave me something that actually were sensible, that further supported the things that I from the EU group, and in considering how were geological features created on this Earth, and in a fashion that could be quicker than millions and billions of years.
And we even see the myth of Mount Fuji being created in a day, and whether that's true or not. Let me ask you, in your experiments, is the electricity creating stone? And if it's not stone, what is it? Because you're using wet mud.
Yeah, so this is
or clay.
I took a terracotta modeling clay that you can purchase from the art store, and took that and mixed it with water and got a very even mixture. So it was a very fine mud mixture, and placed 2 electrodes over the surface and discharged to it, and the material actually combines and it's pulled out of the water, and it evaporates the water off of this material, layering this surface and creating these features that look just like buttes I've climbed up on. And at this scale, again, it's hard, dry mud, so it is hard. I would say if the right conditions, if this could be baked after this, it would absolutely be a clay rock, like a regular terracotta clay. But at this scale, if this was the same scale as a feature we would see on the Earth, I would absolutely agree. It would then appear or be a rock of a butte or a mountain.
Yeah, your work is awesome, and I want to ask you also, when we talk about these ancient thunderbolts of the gods and this ancient cataclysm, what do you think determines if we get a carved out canyon versus a raised up mountain feature?
Sure. In my experience and my observations, water is the key. I started off by looking at people that are using electricity to create Lichtenberg patterns in wood. So whenever I first built my rig, I started off with that test because I wanted to, first of all, verify, can I recreate what they're doing, which is simply placing 2 electrodes on the surface of wood, and when it's dry, it does nothing. But if there's any amount of moisture, like you take a spray bottle and just spray a mist on top, it creates a conductive path for electricity then to try to find the shortest path to connect to. And that's what etches out and burns those Lichtenberg patterns that look just like the fluvial versions of rivers, or kind of like the Grand Canyon, for example, if you were looking at it at a massive scale comparison. So when I'm doing these experiments with clay, if I have a purely dry clay ball and I try to discharge through it or on the surface, it does nothing until water is added. So a small amount of moisture will lead to etching, popping, little miniature explosions where the energy is looking for the water. Whatever moisture it could find underneath the surface will heat it up, and it kind of seems like a little plasmoid's created wherever that connection is under the earth, or the telluric current, if you want to call it that, and it'll explode it out. Now, the complete opposite side, like you're seeing here with this mud moisture, if it's very wet and the content is more moisture, it will pull that material out and then start to evaporate off the liquid, leaving behind a surface feature like you're seeing here. That's reminds me exactly like what I saw in Phoenix. I could see that preview on the right, the Park. I actually recorded this video of this experiment the week before I went to Phoenix, and drove by this place and saw it, and it looked identical. Well, it looked very similar. Let's just say the way that it's formed looks very similar to what I saw there on a very small scale in the lab.
Right, and I
The way,
agree. I agree, and I watched this video, and it was completely fascinating. Let me also ask you: are all mountains and electrical-looking canyons electrical scarring? And if they're not, can we identify which ones are?
sure. There are definitely other processes in play. It's not only electricity, and electricity is not the pure cause of it. However, I think it is the root foundation of how our universe works and how our system functions. If I want to look at even our weather patterns with the lightning and volcanoes and earthquakes, all of the activity on the Earth, it's definitely attributed to additional energy that right now we can observe from a CME or a solar flare sun. It dramatically affects our magnetosphere, which then either puts compression and different electrical tension on the surface of our planet, which then again will affect the crustal layers and the ocean and how the atmosphere is functioning. So by that nature, the features that we're seeing, again, I think happen during major cataclysmic times. I don't think that electricity has a play on today's geology. It doesn't affect it much, and we're just seeing the normal erosion patterns that we're able to observe. But I believe in the distant past, several events happened that formed a lot of these features. But some things that you'll see, especially on some of these mountains or buttes, is a triangular buttress. And Andy Hall outlines that process very well, and he uses a lot of math and graphics and things that I don't like dealing with the number side of it, but I recommend looking up Andy Hall and the processes that he is working through. Triangular buttresses, for example, would be a result of vibration. If you've seen any kind of cymatics with liquid or any kind of material, that's a vibration that's giving you some sort of pattern. So if there was a massive arc discharge to the planet, you would see some sort of electrical scarring, but the results of pressure from at sonic speed coming down and going outward, you would see triangular buttresses form in those areas where it's a big arc blast. Some areas that would have a longer standing current connected, I think, would form more so rivers and canyons.
So those buttresses would be one example of what to look for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anytime you're seeing, I look for spiral patterns. There's lots of spiral patterns across the globe in the geology. Generally, there is areas where you can zoom out of the scale and see that a spiral pattern goes larger and larger. So if you've ever looked at a diactron instability or looked at fluid dynamics, when you have pressure moving over something or through something, it's going to create these little eddies that go in different directions, and that's what I see. So to me it's a combination of the earth, wind, water, but I believe the method that is on a larger view still influenced by the electrical current and potential of the atmosphere to ground. So if you have some large scale event like a massive solar flare, possibly a passing comet that came too close, maybe the ancient talks about a comet or the planet Venus looking or appearing as a comet passing too close, Mars coming too close, or even go back to the ideas of Saturn being the original sun and Earth directly below it, with Saturn rotating, being at our central pole. If we were in a polar axial alignment, and we separated from that when the sun came in to influence and pull us towards it being the new attractor, that potential in electricity and that discharge would absolutely, in my mind, cause something like running too much current through a capacitor to the point to where once it can't handle it, it explodes or it expands and just violently has a cause and effect here. So in my mind, I imagine the Earth was possibly even smaller. If you look at the globe as it is today, you took away the oceans and just had it in your hands and pushed it together, and you could push this thing back together. It looks like a sphere that was overcharged and torqued open, just like as the ancients describe of the deep opening up and all of these catastrophic things happening on Earth. I think there was at least one major event with several, subsequent events following that. My belief is that the original destruction and the biggest things we see on the Earth were caused by the separation from Saturn, if in fact that theory was true, with additional surface scarring by the close passing of Venus and Mars and the battles in the sky as was described.
Right, and
with Jupiter with his cosmic thunderbolt ending the battle.
Right, and I think
now,
it is true.
Yeah.
You're talking about the polar configuration taught to us by Dave Talbot from the Thunderbolts Project, and
yes, sir.
Bringing that up, and also in light of Velikovsky's book Earth in Upheaval, what are your thoughts on the Ice Age? Was there just one Ice Age because of the loss of the polar configuration? Because mainstream wants to tell us that there were multiple Ice Ages over millions and millions of years. And I think you would agree that mainstream has some serious dating issues.
Sure. Well, my opinion is that if we did belong under a configuration that was in an axial alignment underneath Saturn, and we were within a plasma sheath where the ancient humans only observed what they call the purple dawn of time, or the times of Adam and Eve. And then that's when beasts could walk and lay beside humans, and everybody was happy. Everybody had every resource they wanted. Plant life was abundant on Earth, and everything was happy. But there was a time when all of a sudden the god or the gods reacted and punished Earth. There's very, very different stories, obviously, but
right.
For us to go from being in a world of everything is fine versus now everyone's trying to survive after describing all of these catastrophic stories, that would change that. That would allude to some of the stories that we hear and how they're describing what they saw. So my viewpoint on the Ice Age is, I think there was possibly a time when we separated in between, transversing from Saturn to the Sun. I would imagine there would be a time when we were outside the warm glow of the Saturn sheath, where the Earth became very cold. And even the Native Americans describe a time when the first white rains appeared on the Earth and it got cold. So the ancients described the time before it was never cold, and a time came after many disasters that the white rain started, and then the seasons began. So there's another gentleman that has a very similar theory to Dave Talbot's in the polar configuration. His name is No Cook, and unfortunately he passed away a few months ago. But he has a website called SaturnianCosmology.org, and he has all of his life's research is there, and he put together some fascinating imagery of how this configuration could have looked and how it could have transgressed. And I imagine that if, again, we were living under Saturn, that was our primary star, and the sun's influence got close enough to discharge against Saturn, Saturn would have flared, and this configuration would have broken apart. And that's where the stories of the goddess, Venus, started to come into play, with the beautiful spires coming up in between what was originally egg, the cosmic egg, or the eye. The eye of Ra being Venus, and then Mars in front of it. But Venus would be the conductor in between, or that's discharging, that's having this discharge effect and creating these plasma filaments coming out. And you get the stories of the crown and the hand with the eye in it.
Right, she was the Queen of Heaven.
The Queen of Heaven, yes. So at some point in time, it transitioned from there being one god to multiple gods, with one deity being a goddess, which any research I've done, everything links back to Venus. And then Mars being the birth child, if you will,
This is
coming
the-
from
Go on.
and turning into being the warrior planet,
Right.
to lead this cosmic heavenly battle. So I imagine originally being under Saturn, transversing over to the sun, but during that time, a freezing period, possibly followed by multiple periods, and then close passing of Venus, and then Mars, with different discharge effects and elemental effects on the planet. There's the gods of wind, the gods of fire, and the gods of water. So, I think all of these elements are related to different events that took place in our skies.
Right, and I believe that Venus was this light bearer cast out of heaven. And
was also the morning star assigned to Lucifer.
Exactly. And let me ask you, do you think during this ancient event, when we had the thunderbolts of the gods, that they could reach under water and affect the surface underwater, even all the way to the seafloor?
Absolutely. I think that's the primary basis of the island change that you see off of many of the coastlines. If you look at Google Earth in the ocean, you can see chains, usually spiraling chains that either go along the edges, all these little dotted patterns of what I would see as, today we see lightning sometimes discharging into the ocean, but on a grander scale, if that discharge could reach into the ocean to the sea floor, I could see how if there was enough power, it could pull that material towards the surface to create an island. On a grand scale, there is lots of spiraling and patterns that connect around the world, to me, that again further support the Earth having expanded significantly at one time, with potential subsequent expansions. The major thing that I consider is the magnetic anomalies of each of those. The patterns as you look through the major crack in the ocean, the magnetism reverses from north to south. So again, if the Earth was pulled a stable orbit under Saturn, and then is in between two different potential influences where our magnetic pole is constantly flipping during this event as it's expanding out, that would make sense for why the magnetic record was left in the oceanic beds the way they're left. And they completely match the puzzle piece. So if you squash this thing together, they appear to fit to a perfect sphere, or the original Earth. Even scriptures will say that there was a new heaven and a new earth created. Lakota nations say that there was a world destruction, describing almost what I'm saying, but just in different words.
Right.
So
and also
I can't discount what the natives or the ancient people say and have kept in lineage and the stories that they've kept on for a reason. Something significant happened.
And I can't help but think about when the Bible talks about the beast rising out of the sea, that this is probably the memory that they're referring to.
Sure, like Typhon, being one of those, or you have the legend or lore of the Loch Ness monster, or these sea creatures that will attack or eat you, or causing these magnificent things viewed in the sky. So again, if our atmosphere is right now affected by a CME, or a solar flare from the sun at its current state, what would it be like if two stars were then exchanging potential and we were stuck in the middle? It could lead for some very interesting visual effects. And I compare everything now to what can we see today in the sky, which we see lightning everywhere. We see a lot of the storm systems following the same paths across the Earth with its existing electrical and atmospheric teleconnection. And the aurora itself are visible at both of the poles, and they become very excited when activity from the sun reaches us, and as the charge potential increases, it pushes that aurora wave. Not only does it get more beautiful and brighter, but it'll actually push and squash that towards the middle hemisphere. So,
and if you get enough power going on between these two planets, maybe this is where you get this squatter man plasma formation, right?
absolutely. Yeah. So that brings me to plasma lab work like Anthony Peratt at Los Alamos Labs, and back in the day, this was maybe in the late 90s or early 2000s. I believe after those experiments happened where he's created these squatter man or stick man on stone type discharge configurations, the mythologist David Talbot started looking at, hey, look at this comparison between the petroglyphs and what you're making with plasma in a laboratory, which then set off a worldwide collection and aggregation of millions of petroglyphs around the world that then were put into a database and compared to all of these different Peratt instabilities, one of them being the squatter man, which, if you look at the owl, or what a lot of people look at as an alien head or the alien eyes, or the stick man on stone, which looks like a human, it would only make sense to me that if we were in ancient times and we had no clue what electricity was, and we were trying to find out the meaning of life and what we were experiencing and all of these hardships and destruction, if you saw the moon, for example, light up with a discharge and there was electricity flowing between the moon, maybe between our planet to the moon and something else, the moon would, I believe, light up and create that same type of formation just from that plasma discharge. Not saying that's going to happen or that's how it happened, but Jupiter, right. I think Jupiter was the squatter man that they saw.
And so the planets being the gods to the ancient people, when they started raining down destruction upon the earth in seeming judgment, I can imagine the ancients trying to figure out what are the gods trying to tell us or show us, and you get this idea that, okay, we are created in the image of God because they're seeing this stickman plasma.
Absolutely, something that looks similar to something they can relate to. So, for example, Navajo land, there's a wall of 1,000 handprints, and it's just hand everywhere. And these are next to all of these other petroglyphs of all the gods and the deities that they supposedly were scribing in there, which people relate to animals and people, making it up as just artwork. But if there was a discharge from Venus, as we see even in other cultures around the world, the hand of God, the hand with the eye in the center, the crown, the spikes, as if Mars, in our perspective from Earth to Saturn with the two planets in between, if that perspective was seen with Mars appearing to come down and as Venus was flaring, it could certainly look like a hand, which, man tries to, it's said in the scripture, God made man in his own image, but I think man tries to make God in his own image, trying to relate what is life and what is the meaning of this.
Right.
So it would be natural to me to associate myself with what I see in the sky that's going to determine whether I live or die.
And so what we see are snapshots of the morphing collapse of the configuration and the plasma changing.
Yes, sir.
With Venus's interaction with Saturn plasmatically and possibly Mars.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you've heard the story of Santa living at the North Pole with his white beard and his red coat,
bringing gifts.
Bringing gifts, and the Christmas tree or the world mountain, with what I think is Mars being at the top of the mountain and Saturn being the star on top of the Christmas tree.
Right. Right.
And you hear the story of Santa needing it's dark, so he needs Rudolph to light the way with his bright red nose. And to me, that seems like Mars leading the procession, as we go towards the sun. Even the Egyptians have an engraving that looks an awfully like Santa's sleigh and reindeer.
And I've seen petroglyphs kind of hinting at the same thing that you're talking about now. I also think that
Absolutely.
the menorah from the Old Testament that they saw on the mountain was actually this squatter man seen on the cosmic mountain.
I agree. Parat instabilities definitely show all the variations of what that world tree could be, which it could be like a candelabra or a centipede, with variations of how many arms are on the centipede or that tree, or how many branches are on the tree with the olives. A lot of different associations and parables, which even in the scripture, in the Bible, it says Jesus taught in parables. So a parable is associating something familiar to your culture or your environment that you can depict and relate something to something that's different. So I don't think it's a fault of modern day to not understand. I think it's encrypted and it's right in front of our face. It's locked into the belief system of the 1900s, and still stuck even from 60 years ago with Einstein's theory of relativity, when he didn't know about plasma physics. And a significant change in technology and advancements has happened since then. And a lot of findings, even of Velikovsky's, what Velikovsky said could be possible, a lot of his theories have been proven correct.
Right.
Venus, he thought would be at least 800 degrees, and they found it to be like 900 and something degrees, when the rest of the scientific community at the time was like, no way, it can't be that way, right?
Right.
Or even the magnetic rings around Jupiter. Until we had today's technology to verify what these postulates were, everybody just laughed at some of these nonsensical ideas. But it's, you have to have empirical evidence for a man to accept this can happen. Unless you see it with your own eyes, it's just a belief.
Now, when I watch your experiments, I can't help but wonder what we would see if you could slowly move the current along to simulate planetary rotation. Any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've tried to do that to a degree. When I first started this little lab experiment, this year, I had 2 clay balls attached to these electrodes, and I had one that was stationary and just moved the other one around the edges. And it did give me little discharge effects that was more so just drying the water from the surface of the clay. But the visual appearance looked like some of the features I would see on Mars or Venus from a distance. Trying to figure out how can I have these things rotate but still have electricity in there is something I've originally had in my plans. I just haven't gotten there yet. But I did just get a vacuum, and I wanted to try to create something within the space of a vacuum that I think would give me a more accurate view of plasma discharge between planets in space. But at the same time, I also have a feeling that a lot of these planets like Mars or Venus had a different atmosphere before all this happened anyway.
I think so too.
So even in that factor, when I first got into this, everybody was saying, no, you need to do this in a vacuum. But I thought, well, if I'm trying to create features that I see on Earth's surface, we have an atmosphere, so I'm going to do it in our regular atmosphere. I can go back later and try it in a vacuum to see how it would respond differently.
Well, I think I need to set up a GoFundMe page to enhance your laboratory. What do you have planned for the future?
Okay with that. My future is to build. Obviously, I have a vacuum now, so I need to figure out the best course of building a vacuum chamber. Obviously, something with higher speed cameras. I do have a microscope, a digital microscope that I use to get a lot of the close-up features. But I'm trying to get to where I could have multiple discharges going on, possibly multiple transformers to emulate what would a global circuit or a planetary or even solar system circuit look like if you did have in fact, the different potentials. There's, to me, electromagnetism rules the cosmos, and Jupiter, I believe, is the mediator. I think Jupiter is the savior that's described as the exalted Jesus, if you will. I'm not trying to be a heretic there, but I really think that the planetary movements and interactions from the past have affected what our current culture and systems are, and it's to the point to where everyone is in conflict with who's right and who's wrong.
Right, and
my goal has been to set out to dismiss the things that I've been learning and how my beliefs have been reinforced by coming across this theory. It picks all of the nonsense out of science. To me, mainstream science is science fiction because it's all based off of using formulas. But I'm also a business professional, so if I have an agenda to get to a resolution using math, I can figure out a formula to get to that end answer. What we can't do is use math to determine if black holes and dark matter are real or whatever it is. If they could, and again, I'm not saying that science as a whole is this way. It's just when something dealing with electricity and the formations, anybody that's challenging what is currently accepted worldwide becomes a heretic in that fashion, and they get outed. Even Anthony Peratt, which I think, reading some of his papers, especially with his plasma work comparing to the petroglyphs and the research showing the viewpoints of where all these plasma displays were made in the sky in relation to where these people were to be protected from ionic winds and whatnot. It's such a huge breakthrough, but the world as we know it is based off of the confines of the foundation that's been built off of, with our governments and our societies and the world culture. So that's, I think, the real reason why there's a separation of church and state. But now we're getting to a moment in time where the internet brings us all of the information we want at our fingertips, and it's us to do our own research to refine what do we really believe, what makes sense, what is logical. And I've trolled Google Earth for years looking at all of these features and questioning how could this process happen and why would it have to take millions and millions of years, removing humans from the process or removing humans from the memory of these processes taking place. But when science says and what Native Americans say, it's in confliction, and I believe the Native Americans over a scientist.
I do too.
Even though scientists have their little silos they live in and don't talk to other people that are having similar focus, but they're so separated, they don't want to compare together to say, would this actually work if we put it all together? So my goal has been to dismiss everything I've learned about the electric universe. Is it right or wrong? And every time I look at new information and I compare it, it only reinforces my belief that that is the most sensible and logical theory that exists based on my own religious upbringing and scriptural study and study of all of the world cultures and beliefs out there. I don't think any religion is wrong. I think the foundation of every religion and every world culture is absolutely correct. But they are misinterpreting the parables, if you will, or the translation. It's like playing pass it down. I tell you a sentence and a story, gotta pass it down, and by the time it gets to the 10th person, the story's a little bit different.
Right.
Right?
Right. And so this electric universe community is certainly the emerging superior science. And
yeah, I don't want to say anybody's superior, but I will say it's. I think we're a humble set of folks that have a lot of questions that are looking at real evidence and making a really strong case towards the majority of science needs to take a serious look at the electrical effects on geology and how the planets are connected, and how our sun very well may be a plasmoid in the middle of a Birkeland current connected to all of these other solar systems. I don't believe it's just an base of dark matter. But just simply by calling it matter means it's not empty. So there's a lot of contradictions in I think the scientific.
Well, even
So I think the Electric Universe guys are bringing a lot to light that makes people question. And until more people will start to question and compare, they can come to their own conclusion on what do they think is correct. But my belief is that more and more people will see things like what I'm doing or what others in the community are doing. That will spawn a lot more empirical data because our science up until I want to say the mid 1900s, or 1960, I want to say is around the time when science went from doing tests to then doing everything by formulas and calculations, and that's where science took a left turn, in my opinion.
Right, and even mainstream is finding these filaments that are connecting galaxies and showing that everything really is connected on some level.
Yeah, this meerkat image you're showing here, I believe this image is set out to capture an image of the black hole, but it sure looks opposite to me.
Yeah, that looks like anything but a black hole.
Yeah, it looks a pearl string of stars or plasmoid explosions. A focus, not explosions. I would say a focus of energy, not an outward explosion of that word. So I used the wrong term.
And those are likely, those filaments are likely Birkeland currents, I would imagine.
I believe so, and I think that's how the cosmos are connected. To the larger scale version of whatever it is, and we don't know. And I think for man to say this is how it is, and this is how it has to be, and this is what you must believe because we said so, or based off of a group consensus vote, is not correct.
Right.
So
I think we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, there's I think with the Parker Solar Probe that they've launched to the sun is going to help us understand the dynamics of the sun more in depth, as well as experiments that we can do here on the Earth. For example, Sapphire. I'm very impressed with them trying to recreate a star in the lab.
Right, the Sapphire Project.
Those, yeah, things like that. That to me is the most real scientific experiment that's taking place to emulate what we would call an electric sun or a plasmoid.
Yeah, I've got my eye on
some
that.
Interesting results.
I definitely have my eye on the Sapphire Project as well. But man, it has been so awesome to have you here. And I hope that anyone listening to this will subscribe to your channel, Electric Universe Eyes. And I hope that we can talk again. And I'm going to be looking forward to whatever you put out in the future.
I would love that, man. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'll keep doing experiments, and hopefully we can link up again in the future.
I'm going to see if I can get that GoFundMe page going.
All right. Hey, I'll take it. I wouldn't mind expanding my lab.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope everyone has a great night. Take care, and thank you again.
Bye-bye.